History often remembers wars as contests of armies, maps, arrows, divisions colliding across continents. But wars are just as often decided in rooms with no windows, by men whose pride, fear, and ego weigh as heavily as tanks and artillery. In those rooms, reputations are forged, illusions are built, and myths are born, some carefully crafted long after the fighting has ended. In the winter of 1944, as Germany prepared one final gamble in the West, three of its most powerful commanders stood humiliated in a mountain bunker. What followed would shape not only the Battle of the Bulge, but the stories told about the war for decades afterward. Stories about who the Germans truly feared and who they quietly dismissed. December 11th, 1944, Hitler's Western headquarters. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood rigid against a concrete wall, his hands raised in silent compliance. Beside him were Field Marshal Walter Model and General Hasso von Manteuffel, the three most senior commanders responsible for Germany's war in the West. And yet, in that moment, none of them held power. SS guards moved in without ceremony. Sidearms were reportedly confiscated. Jackets were searched. Briefcases were ripped open and examined. These men, raised in the traditions of the old Prussian officer class, where honor was valued above life itself, were treated like suspected criminals by political enforcers they despised. The room was thick with unspoken rage. Then Adolf Hitler began to speak. Inside the bunker, trembling with conviction, he unveiled what he believed would be his decisive stroke. Operation Wacht am Rhein. 200,000 German soldiers would surge through the Ardennes, shatter the Allied front, and seize the port of Antwerp. The Western Allies, Hitler insisted, were decadent and soft. Americans, he sneered, were cowboys and playboys, men who would panic and flee at the first shock of battle, just as they had at Kasserine Pass 2 years earlier. Manteuffel listened in silence. He had fought the Americans face to face. He knew better. They were not fragile amateurs who would collapse under pressure. But there was something else the German High Command misunderstood, something far more consequential, and something that would only become clear decades later. For years after the war, a particular narrative dominated the history books. German generals, writing memoirs and giving interviews, claimed they had feared George S. Patton from the very beginning. They insisted they had tracked his movements obsessively, from North Africa to Normandy. Patton, they said, was the one man who haunted their thoughts. It was a flattering story for the Americans, and a convenient one for defeated German commanders. But when historians finally gained access to the original intelligence files, the reports written in real time while the war was still raging, the truth emerged, and it was startling. In February 1944, months before D-Day, German intelligence compiled detailed dossiers on every major Allied commander expected to lead the invasion. Eisenhower had a file. Montgomery's was exhaustive. Bradley's was thorough. Patton's file barely existed. There was no fixation, no fear, barely even a mention until August 1944. The Germans had not been watching Patton closely. They had been ignoring him. So how did the man they overlooked become the man they later claimed to fear above all others? And if Patton wasn't the focus of their attention, who was? The answers surfaced during post-war interrogations conducted by American military historians and the British strategist B.H. Liddell Hart. Captured German generals were questioned at length about how they truly viewed their Allied opponents. Their responses painted a far more nuanced and far less flattering picture. Among Allied commanders, few inspired genuine contempt. Mark Clark, commander of the U.S. Fifth Army in Italy, Clark was tall, charismatic, and deeply invested in his own image. He maintained a personal public relations staff. He arranged photographers carefully. He believed history owed him greatness. Opposing him was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy. After the war, Kesselring assessed Clark with barely concealed disdain. Clark, he explained, was predictable because he was vain. He would always choose the course of action that promised headlines, even when it defied military logic. The proof came in May 1944 at Anzio. Clark's forces had broken out of the beachhead. The German 10th Army was retreating, exposed, stretched, vulnerable. Clark had a rare opportunity to encircle and annihilate an entire enemy army. Instead, he turned toward Rome. He wanted to be the liberator of the First Axis capital. He wanted the photographs, the glory, the legacy. The German 10th Army escaped, regrouped, and fought on. While Clark posed for cameras in the Colosseum, American infantrymen continued to die in the mud and mountains of northern Italy, fighting the same enemy Clark had failed to destroy. The images were magnificent. The cost was measured in blood. Kesselring's chief of staff later remarked that Clark was one of Germany's greatest assets in Italy, not because of incompetence, but because his ego made him easy to read. If Clark was predictable through vanity, Bernard Montgomery was predictable through caution. Montgomery, commander of the British 21st Army Group, was a national hero, the victor of El Alamein. German generals respected his discipline, but they understood him completely. Rundstedt described him as methodical to a fault. Montgomery would never attack without overwhelming superiority. That approach worked, if time allowed. It also meant the Germans always knew what was coming. During interrogation, General Gunther Blumentritt demonstrated Montgomery's style by slowly walking across the room, placing one foot carefully in front of the other. No sudden movements, no risks. Montgomery required numerical dominance, prolonged bombardment, and rigid schedules. He stopped at nightfall. He consolidated rather than exploited. That made him dangerous, but beatable. Speed, not strength, was the answer. Only once did Montgomery abandon his cautious formula. Operation Market Garden. It was bold, airborne, aggressive, everything Montgomery usually avoided, and it ended in disaster. Nearly 17,000 Allied casualties. The British 1st Airborne Division shattered at Arnhem. Paratroopers were left isolated, sacrificed in an attempt by a cautious general to prove he could gamble. German commanders noted the irony. The one time Montgomery tried to act like Patton, he proved precisely why he should not have. Yet not all British commanders earned criticism. Harold Alexander, commander of the Allied forces in Italy, was held in genuine respect. Where Montgomery was rigid, Alexander was adaptable. Where Montgomery demanded control, Alexander coordinated. Kesselring called him a gentleman and meant it as the highest professional praise. Alexander commanded what Kesselring described as a mongrel army. Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, Poles, Indians, Brazilians, New Zealanders, dozens of nationalities, doctrines, and languages. Holding them together required diplomacy Montgomery never possessed. Alexander understood coalition warfare. He adapted. He trusted subordinates. He adjusted to circumstance rather than forcing doctrine onto reality. German generals saw in him the commander Montgomery might have been, had he possessed humility. When interrogators asked German officers about British leadership, the pattern was consistent. Criticism for Montgomery, respect for Alexander. Even in a war defined by brutality, there were moments of professional recognition across enemy lines. They wanted to defeat Alexander's army, but they would salute the man who led it. And then there was Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, controller of more military power than any man in history. German generals did not view him as a battlefield commander at all. Rundstedt's judgment was blunt. Eisenhower was not a general. He was a coordinator, a political figure managing an alliance, not a soldier shaped by combat. And in that assessment lay another truth about the war, one the Germans understood too late. German generals understood something many later critics missed. Keeping the Allied coalition together was an achievement in itself. Americans and Britons did not share the same strategic instincts. The Free French brought political sensitivities into every decision. Air, land, and naval power had to be synchronized across multiple fronts, multiple cultures, and multiple egos. That required a rare kind of intelligence. Eisenhower possessed it. What he lacked in German eyes was the instinct to kill. Von Manteuffel told interrogators that Eisenhower's devotion to the broad front strategy was fundamentally flawed. Rather than concentrate overwhelming force at a single decisive point, Eisenhower pushed everywhere at once. Pressure was applied evenly. Progress was constant, but never catastrophic. Rundstedt agreed. He argued that a single massive thrust past Aachen toward the Ruhr would have shattered the already fragile German line and ended the war by the autumn of 1944. Instead, Eisenhower kept every army moving and every ally satisfied. The result, in their judgment, was 6 additional months of war. To them, this proved Eisenhower thought like a statesman, not a battlefield commander. He could not bring himself to elevate one subordinate at the expense of another. He could not accept that decisive warfare often demanded political discomfort. He kept the coalition intact, but he never delivered the final blow. A chairman, not an executioner. Omar Bradley commanded the largest American formation in Europe, the 12th Army Group, more than 1 million men. German generals found him difficult to judge because he was difficult to notice. Bradley did not chase headlines like Clark. He did not cultivate legend like Patton. He did not demand attention like Montgomery. He simply commanded. Rundstedt described him as competent and methodical, high praise from a Prussian aristocrat, even if it lacked drama. Bradley was professional. Bradley was reliable. Bradley was precisely what one expected an American general to be. That made him dangerous in a quieter way. Bradley would not gamble recklessly, but he would not blunder either. He applied pressure steadily, relentlessly, until something gave way. German officers noted that his approach mirrored American industrial power itself. He did not require brilliance. He had abundance. His task was to apply it without catastrophic error, and he did. The breakout from St. Lo, the dash across France, the containment of the Bulge. Each operation was sound, controlled, and successful. German commanders respected Bradley, but they did not fear him. He was a professional opponent, not a nightmare. Courtney Hodges, commander of the U.S. First Army, presented a different paradox. His army fought more Germans than almost any other Allied formation. It bled in Normandy. It smashed German lines at Aachen. It ground forward through the Hürtgen forest. Yet most German generals struggled to remember Hodges himself. They remembered the army remember the weight of it. Von Manteuffel's assessment captured the truth. The Americans, he said, fought like a machine, relentless, impersonal, unstoppable. Individual commanders mattered less than the system behind them. First Army never ran out of ammunition. It never lost air cover. When a unit was destroyed, another appeared. When a tank burned, a replacement rolled forward. German generals had been trained to hunt weaknesses in commanders. Against the American machine, those weaknesses were irrelevant. You could outthink a man. You could mislead a general. You could not outmaneuver a factory. Facing First Army did not feel like a contest of minds. It felt like death delivered by artillery schedule. That realization terrified them more than any individual officer ever could. Patton was dangerous. Montgomery was predictable. But American industry was inevitable. Hodges was competent and unremarkable. But the machine required neither genius nor charisma, only management. And then there was Patton. Before D-Day, German intelligence barely noticed him. There was no profile, no sustained surveillance. They assumed he had been sidelined after the slapping incidents. A problem solved. They learned otherwise in August 1944. Patton's Third Army exploded out of Normandy and advanced nearly 400 miles in 2 weeks. German situation maps were obsolete almost as soon as they were drawn. Rundstedt's evaluation shifted instantly. After the war, he told American interrogators bluntly, Patton was not one of their best. He was the most dangerous. Model compared him to Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine. Kesselring said Patton had turned tank warfare into an art, likening him to Rommel himself. Coming from a man who had fought both, it was the highest possible praise. General Bayerlein, a former Rommel subordinate, offered the sharpest insight. Other Allied commanders, he said, allowed encircled Germans to slip away. Patton would not. He did not believe Patton would ever let them escape so easily. The Battle of the Bulge sealed German judgment. German planners assumed the Americans would need 2 weeks to react. Patton pivoted 3 divisions 90 degrees and attacked within 48 hours. Von Manteuffel received the reports and could scarcely believe them. An entire army had moved 100 miles through winter storms in 2 days. The maps said it was impossible. The calculations said it could not happen. And then, through snow and fog, came the sound of engines where silence was expected. It was not merely maneuver, it was shock. After that, German commanders never underestimated Patton again, but Patton was not alone. Lucian Truscott never became a legend. He never commanded an army group. He never posed for magazines or inspired films. German commanders in Italy feared him more than most others, except Patton himself. When Truscott took command of 6th Corps at Anzio in February 1944, the beachhead had stagnated. Under General John Lucas, German forces had contained the landing and slowly squeezed the Americans. Within days, German staff officers noticed the difference. Positions once static became aggressive. Units that had hesitated now probed relentlessly. Nothing had changed except the man in command. Truscott enforced a brutal marching pace known as the Truscott Trot. His units moved faster than doctrine allowed. They attacked before defenders expected. They exploited gaps before the enemy could react. Feet blistered. Men collapsed. Truscott pushed them anyway. He understood the arithmetic of war. Sweat saves blood. Speed saves lives. Hesitation kills. German commanders recognized genuine tactical brilliance. Truscott did not seek fame, but he understood mobile warfare as deeply as Patton did. After the war, when Germans listed the Allied commanders who truly concerned them, Truscott's name appeared alongside Patton's. Not Montgomery, not Bradley, not Clark. Professionals recognize professionals. In the end, German generals judged Allied commanders by a simple metric: who kept them awake at night? Clark gave them opportunities. Montgomery gave them time. Eisenhower gave them 6 more months of war. Bradley and Hodges delivered a slow, grinding death. Alexander earned respect. Truscott earned fear. Patton earned both. Those rankings arguably tell us less about the Allies than about what Germany had lost. They respected men like Alexander and Truscott because they resembled the old professional officer class. They feared the American machine and Patton's speed because those forces represented the future. And in that future, there was no place left for them.